Hi everyone. So, with The Witcher 3 having been out for a couple of days now, we can get a pretty good idea as to how things have gone for this particular game. And I'm afraid things aren't really great news here, certainly not if you're a PC gamer. There appears to have been a few shenanigans a couple of months before launch that has desperately compromised the performance quality of AMD's Radeon GPUs and even Nvidia's own 700 and 600 series cards. So what or who do we have to thank for this? Well, it would appear, based on things that have been made publicly available by the developers and by Nvidia and by AMD, it's turned into a little bit of a slanging match, that it would seem the developers decided to include Nvidia's Hairworks technology, part of GameWorks, which is basically like a set of additional APIs for doing things like hair, cloth physics, and so on. Now, the problem here is it appears to have been dropped in 2 months before the game's launch. Now, bearing in mind, this is in the delayed period, when the game had been delayed. They've dropped this in, and it's obliterated the frame rates for the majority of cards. Now, this seems to even have an impact if you're not using Hairworks, from what we can tell from various bits of information being released by journalists and so on who had pre-release builds and so on. There seems to be something amiss here. Now, we know that the Hairworks system requires tessellation, something that AMD's cards aren't particularly good at, and something that the 700 and 600 series cards are not particularly good at either. However, when we started digging into the config files for The Witcher 3 on PC, we found something really interesting. For some reason, Hairworks had its MSAA, basically a form of anti-aliasing, cranked up to 8 times. Now, essentially what we're doing here is we're wasting performance anti-aliasing strands of hair 8 times every pass. What the heck? I mean, from my mind, it seems that either developers or Nvidia have done a really ballsed up job at even optimising this going in for people whose cards could support it. Either that, or there has been a conscious effort here to make sure that basically anything but Nvidia's latest GPUs are going to see really shoddy performance with this turned on. No great surprise if you're running it at 8 times, blimey. So if you imagine that they claim 40,000 strands of hair and 6,000 strands of hair on a beard, and then each one of those strands is being hit 8 times for anti-aliasing, it's no wonder we're seeing crippling performance with this turned on. But again, there is real performance bottleneck problems here on older cards, and these aren't cards that, in my opinion, I would describe as being over the hill. These are 700 series GPUs released, last year? The year before? These aren't exactly old cards. And when we see performance on the 960 series card, a bottom of the range card, outperforming the frame rate of the 780 Ti, there is something very badly wrong going on here. It does strike me that there's been some shenanigans, and either a crippled rendering path has been provided via Nvidia's GameWorks to cripple the 700 series GPUs, or the developers have done a truly shoddy job at optimising for cards that they originally built this game to run on. Bearing in mind the original release cycle for this game would have placed it squarely on the 700 series GPUs, with the 900 series just starting to make an appearance. It certainly strikes me that this game was delayed so that the newer cards could be on the market, so Hairworks could be included, so Nvidia could look awesome with its new cards, and effectively it could make every card before it obsolete. We've seen this happening just a little bit too much over the last year or so. Something has changed in the way that Nvidia is handling its consumer affairs, and it does seem to be to the detriment of its own customers, not to mention AMD's customers. So what can we do about this? Well, at this point there's an awful lot of information flying around the web that seems to be pointing to the same thing. There is something not right going on here. At the end of the day, we now need to put pressure on both the developers, CD Projekt Red, and on Nvidia to come clean. What the heck was going on here? How can we have had a game delayed for such a long period of time to then find it runs worse on the cards it was originally targeting? Why is it Hairworks was included just 2 months before the launch of a game, and it couldn't have obviously been optimised properly, because we can see the evidence in the config files that it has not been optimised properly? There's a wide range of issues here, and question after question that so far neither the developer or Nvidia has answered. What we have is lots of denials, but no real concrete proof coming from them that, well, the things that we can see aren't actually the impact that we're actually getting. It certainly seems, based on changing these various config settings, that these do make a big impact across a range of different hardware. There is something odd going on here, guys, and I do think that this is not going to be the end of this scenario that we're here, for the simple reason that if it's been done once, Nvidia are going to do it again, and they're going to do it again, and they're going to do it again, because if they get away with it the first time, they'll think they can get away with it every subsequent time. I do think we now need to put a lot of pressure on Nvidia, if nothing else, to end this practice of working with developers in such a way that compromises not only their own older GPUs, but also that of their competitors. There's something rotten about this, mark my words.